Welcome to Functions over Classes, also known as C.A.R.E, also known as Class Abuse Resistance Education. For this, I'm going to talk about the implementation of a keyboard. The base component for this is from a package called React Simple Keyboard, but the actual implementation of it had some work that needed to be done to make it nice to use. We ultimately wanted it to behave like a native keyboard would on a phone. So when you are in a text input for a name, it will automatically capitalize the next letter after a space. When you go to a phone input, it changes to a numerical keypad, and so on. And so here is the extremely abridged version of how this keyboard was implemented in a class. So we're going to take it from the top, and straight up we've got props that are defined because this was wrapped in a higher order component, so we needed to define the props interface. We had state with a default layout of lock, so it was defaulting to uppercase. Then just below this we have component did update, and in this example it could probably be renamed to what layout should the keyboard use, but this is when we needed it to be called. And so we grab some data from props, we compare previous props to current props, and then pretty much just decide which layout the keyboard should use with the switch statement. And in 2 out of 3 cases here, we're just calling set state and updating the layout, but in the third case, we're calling switch title and providing the value of the input. And so if I go down just a little bit to switch title, you can see we've got the value of the input as a string is the argument, and if it ends with a space or its value is an empty string, of length 0, I guess you could otherwise say, we set the state to lock, otherwise we set it to default, which is just all lowercase letters. Moving on, we've got on key press. I've chopped out the part where we actually send keystrokes to the window and all of that, and I've just left in the most important part that's the basis for this section, which is to say if this.props.element.type is text, we set a timeout for 5 milliseconds, and then we call switch title with whatever happens to be in this.props.element.value. And so the reason that this became problematic as the behavior and functionality of the keyboard evolved over time is that a lot can happen in 5 milliseconds. And so when you're working with a class, it's important to remember that the instance actually that's rendered doesn't change, just the data that's rendered does. Also that this is mutable, and that in that 5 millisecond timeout, 100% possible, and definitely did happen, that the value of this.props.element.value can change, and the type is no longer text as well. But when this actually was executed, it was type text, but the value changed. And so we would have this problem where we'd effectively created a race condition, and you would hit the tab button on the keyboard to go into a number input, and it would get stuck on the default text character keyboard. And so fortunately, it was actually really easy to solve, and we did it by moving it to a function component. So taking it from the top once again, we're still managing layout in component state. As you can see, we're using the use state hook. We're setting it to a default of lock. We're still pulling the relevant data out of our application state, our Redux store, but we're using another hook, use selector, rather than using a higher order component to wrap it. And so instantly by doing that, we've removed the need to define a props interface for the component. And then we're using a React hook called use effect, and we're going to dive quite deep into this in a little bit, but it's effectively a replacement for all of your component lifecycle methods that occur in a class. So we go if element, grab this data, set a default as the layout, and then go through that same decision tree by that same switch statement, which is exactly the same as it was before. And then switch title if we need to, and that's the same. And then in on key press, we actually get rid of the set timeout. We don't need that anymore because with use effect, as I say, we're going to dive into this in a moment. There are a few ways to use it, and the way that it's used here, it'll actually run on every render, and it will run through that and update the keyboard to the correct layout. So we no longer have a race condition. We no longer need to think about the context of this and the data that's in it in a class, and it worked perfectly. So I guess the key takeaway here is that not using classes is a really great way to probably avoid headaches down the line in React components, especially as they grow in complexity. There is one thing that you need to be aware of though when comparing functions and class components. When a class component re-renders, it's the same instance. It's not a new copy of that class. It just updates internally and renders that new view, so to speak. But every time a function component is re-rendered, it's a new instance of that function component and everything inside, including all the functions and so on. And sometimes that can be a bad thing, but there are ways to avoid it, and we'll talk about that in more depth in the hooks video. But that's the end of the class abuse resistance education. It's a bit complex. Maybe go back through it and check the code examples if you need to, just to get a better understanding of what's going on. But otherwise, we're going to move on and we're going to start talking about hooks.